Today,
Amy's alive. Taxi driver said her daughter is on this island. She could have been lured on the ship.
I saw her in the restroom off Barbados. I said, "What's your name?" "Amy."
I was in the bar in Curacao. One girl said, "My name is Amy Bradley. I need help."
I thought, that could be Amy.
Somebody saw something? Please let her go. Somebody heard something?
I have information.
before Amy Bradley disappeared aboard Rhapsody of the Seas, nothing about the trip appeared unusual to the people around her. Amy was 23 years old, originally from Virginia, recently graduated from Longwood University with a degree in physical education. Friends and family described her as athletic, independent, and socially confident, someone comfortable around people, energetic enough to move naturally through unfamiliar environments without seeming intimidated by them. She had been working and planning for the future like many people her age, still trying to build adult life piece by piece. And in March of 1998, the family cruise through the Caribbean was supposed to be a temporary escape from ordinary routines. A few days at sea, warm weather, music, open water. Amy traveled with her parents, Ron and Iva Bradley, along with her younger brother, Brad. By nearly every account, the family was close. Because unlike many disappearances that eventually become associated with visible emotional instability or isolation, nothing publicly suggested Amy was trying to separate herself from the people around her before she vanished. There were no obvious warning signs, no indication she planned to disappear voluntarily. If anything, Amy appeared fully engaged in the environment around her. But like many cases that later become difficult to reconstruct emotionally, the details people eventually focused on did not seem important while they were happening. Small interactions, brief conversations, moments involving people on board the ship whose significance only became questionable afterward. During the early days of the cruise, Amy spent time around passengers and members of the ship's entertainment staff near the nightclub and bar areas late at night. Nothing about those interactions initially appeared alarming. Cruise ships are built around temporary social environments. People meet quickly, drink together, dance, then disappear back into crowds they may never see again. And that constant movement between strangers may be part of what later complicated the investigation so severely. Because once Amy Bradley disappeared, investigators were no longer trying to understand a single isolated moment. They were trying to reconstruct a timeline inside a floating city filled with passengers, shifting social interactions, and thousands of people moving through the same enclosed environment without realizing that somewhere among them, the continuity of one person's life was already beginning to break apart. By the evening of March 23, 1998, the atmosphere aboard Rhapsody of the Seas still felt ordinary. The ship was moving toward Curacao. Passengers filled the restaurants, bars, and nightclub areas spread across the upper decks. Music carried through open sections of the ship, while people drifted between conversations, drinking, dancing, and late-night routines that rarely feel important while they are happening. Amy spent part of the evening with her brother Brad, near the ship's nightclub. Multiple passengers later remembered seeing her dancing and socializing around members of the cruise band performing that night, including one crew member investigators would later revisit repeatedly during the investigation. At the time, nothing about those interactions appeared alarming. Like many people on board, Amy simply seemed caught up in the temporary social environment that cruise ships naturally create. As the night continued, the crowd slowly thinned. Sometime after 3 a.m., Amy and Brad returned to the cabin shared with their parents on Deck 8. For a while, the siblings sat outside near the balcony talking quietly, while the ship continued through the Caribbean darkness below them. Eventually, Brad went to sleep. Amy remained outside hours later. Amy's father briefly woke and noticed her still resting near the balcony area. Nothing about the moment appeared unusual enough to disturb him. He went back to sleep. And somewhere in the unnoticed stretch of time that followed, the continuity of the case began to disappear. By morning, Amy Bradley was gone. Some personal belongings remained inside the cabin. Other items appeared missing with her. There was no sign of forced entry, no obvious indication of violence, no clear explanation for how someone could disappear from the middle of a cruise ship without immediately drawing attention. At first, confusion spread more slowly than panic. Family members searched nearby decks. Crew members were notified. Announcements were delayed while the ship continued preparing to dock in Curaçao. And that delay would later become one of the most criticized parts of the entire case. Because by the time broader search efforts began on board, passengers had already started moving on and off the ship normally. The environment investigators later needed to reconstruct had already begun dissolving. Cabins emptied, conversations blurred together. People scattered into different countries, flights, and timelines. And almost immediately, the investigation encountered the same contradiction that still defines the disappearance decades later. Amy Bradley vanished from one of the most physically contained environments imaginable, a crowded cruise ship surrounded by open ocean, without anyone ever clearly establishing the exact moment where ordinary life stopped accounting for where she went next. By the morning of March 24, 1998, the disappearance of Amy Bradley had already become something investigators struggled to explain logically. The Rhapsody of the Seas was not an open environment where movement disappeared easily. It was a contained space surrounded by ocean. Thousands of passengers, limited exits, crew-controlled access points, and yet somewhere between night and sunrise, Amy Bradley vanished without anyone clearly establishing how she left the ship, or whether she ever did. Search operations began quickly after the family reported her missing. Crew members searched decks and common areas while the ship prepared to dock in Curaçao. Soon afterward, the Netherlands Antilles Coast Guard launched a large-scale search operation involving helicopters, radar-equipped aircraft, patrol boats, and surrounding maritime units. Royal Caribbean later hired additional private vessels to continue searching the surrounding water. For 4 days, search teams moved through the Caribbean looking for any physical trace connected to Amy Bradley. Nothing was found. No body, no clothing, no personal belongings floating in the water, no confirmed evidence establishing that Amy had gone overboard. Meanwhile, the ship itself continued its scheduled route through St. Martin and St. Thomas before eventually returning to San Juan on March 28th. That absence of physical evidence immediately complicated the investigation. Because while one possibility remained that Amy entered the water sometime before sunrise, investigators also struggled to explain how such an event could occur without witnesses, noise, or physical evidence on board. At the same time, criticism began growing around the cruise ship's response during the first hours after Amy disappeared. Public announcements were delayed. Passengers continued leaving the ship after docking. And by the time broader investigative efforts intensified, the controlled environment investigators needed to preserve had already begun dissolving into thousands of separate movements, conversations, and timelines. Then another detail emerged. On the morning Amy disappeared, a taxi driver in Curaçao later reported seeing a distressed young woman resembling Amy near a parking area close to the port. According to the account, the woman appeared barefoot and was urgently searching for access to a telephone. The sighting was never conclusively verified, but it became one of the earliest details investigators struggled to fully dismiss. As authorities reconstructed Amy's final known hours on board, attention gradually focused on several individuals who reportedly interacted with her during the night before the disappearance, including members of the ship's entertainment staff. One crew member in particular later received significant public attention after multiple witnesses recalled seeing him with Amy during the early morning hours before she vanished. He denied involvement in her disappearance and was never charged with any crime connected to the case. But uncertainty surrounding those final interactions never fully disappeared from public discussion. Then the sightings began. Months after Amy disappeared, 2 Canadian tourists reported encountering a woman resembling her at a beach in Curaçao, accompanied by 2 unidentified men. One witness later claimed the woman appeared distressed and silently attempted to signal for help before being pulled away from the area. In 1999, an American sailor named William Hefner told investigators that a woman identifying herself as Amy approached him inside a brothel in Curaçao and claimed she was being held against her will. By the time authorities later investigated the location, the building had reportedly burned down. Years later, additional reported sightings emerged from different locations, including Barbados and San Francisco. None were ever conclusively verified, but collectively, they introduced a possibility investigators could never completely eliminate: that Amy Bradley may have survived the night she disappeared from the ship. In 2005, the Bradley family received photographs of a woman known as Jazz, an escort working in the Caribbean whose appearance some believed resembled Amy. The images generated intense public debate, though no definitive identification was ever established. At the same time, the emotional vulnerability surrounding the case also attracted exploitation. During the years following Amy's disappearance, the family was manipulated by an individual claiming he could help rescue her. More than $200,000 was reportedly taken before the operation was later exposed as fraudulent. And over time, the investigation became trapped between multiple competing explanations that never fully aligned with all of the known facts. An accidental fall leaves unanswered questions. Voluntary disappearance conflicts with the evidence left behind, and theories involving foul play remain difficult to conclusively prove inside an environment where the most critical hours passed before investigators fully understood what they were dealing with. In 2010, 12 years after Amy vanished from the ship, she was legally declared dead. But the case itself never truly reached a conclusion, because the central contradiction has never changed. Somewhere aboard a crowded cruise ship surrounded by open ocean, Amy Bradley disappeared, and no one has ever been able to clearly reconstruct the exact moment where the continuity of her life broke apart. The longer Amy Bradley remained missing, the harder the case became to place inside a single coherent explanation, because every possible answer seems to solve one part of the disappearance while creating a different contradiction somewhere else. At first, the simplest explanation appeared to be the ocean itself, a late night, alcohol, a balcony overlooking open water before sunrise. From a distance, the theory feels almost straightforward until the details begin resisting it. No confirmed witness saw Amy fall. No one reported hearing panic or impact. And despite days of coordinated search efforts across the surrounding water, no physical trace connected to her was ever recovered. That absence left room for another possibility to grow quietly in the background. Not that Amy disappeared from the ship accidentally, but that she encountered someone before she vanished. And once investigators began reconstructing the final hours on board, attention naturally drifted toward the people who interacted with her during the night before the disappearance, particularly those connected to the nightclub and entertainment areas where Amy spent part of the evening. But even there, the case never settles cleanly into certainty. Conversations become fragmented. Witness memories shift over time. Speculation grows faster than evidence. And eventually, the investigation moves beyond the ship entirely, because after Curaçao, the case stops behaving like a disappearance that clearly ended in one location. Instead, it begins scattering across years of reported sightings and unresolved encounters. a woman resembling Amy seen on a Caribbean beach beside unfamiliar men, a former sailor describing an encounter inside a Curaçao brothel with someone claiming she was being held against her will. Later reports from Barbados, San Francisco. Photographs mailed anonymously to the Bradley family years afterward, showing a woman whose resemblance to Amy many people found difficult to ignore. None of the sightings were conclusively verified, but together they changed the emotional structure of the case permanently. Because once the possibility exists that Amy survived after leaving the ship, the investigation no longer revolves around a single night in March of 1998. It becomes a question stretching across decades. Was Amy Bradley lost to the ocean? Or did she continue existing somewhere beyond the timeline investigators were able to reconstruct? And maybe that uncertainty explains why the case continues affecting people differently from many other disappearances. Most unresolved cases eventually settle psychologically into one dominant explanation, even without proof. Amy Bradley's never fully does. The ocean remains possible. Foul play remains possible. The sightings remain difficult to completely dismiss, and the absence of definitive evidence allows every theory to continue existing beside the others without fully eliminating them. Which means the central contradiction never actually disappears. A crowded cruise ship, open ocean in every direction, thousands of people nearby. And somewhere inside that enclosed floating world, a young woman vanished so completely that nearly 3 decades later, investigators still cannot clearly identify the moment where the story stopped following ordinary reality and became something far more difficult to explain. What continues to make Amy Bradley's disappearance feel unusually difficult to resolve is not simply the absence of answers, it is the absence of a visible transition. Most unresolved disappearances still contain a moment where the timeline clearly changes shape. A final phone call, a scream, a confirmed sighting entering an isolated location, some identifiable point where ordinary life visibly gives way to crisis. But in Amy's case, that rupture never clearly appears. Instead, the timeline dissolves gradually inside an environment that should have made disappearance harder, not easier.
And once portraits are taken, they're put in the photo gallery on a boat. And then later you can go view them and purchase them if you'd like. And so after that, Ron and I were having a drink, and the main waiter from our table approached us. I had known that when you're on a cruise, the crew members aren't really supposed to approach passengers for conversations or whatever. And he approached us, he walked right up to us, and he said, "Where is Amy?" We said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, we want to take her to Carlos and Charlie's." And I said, "Well, she's with her brother." That was the end of that.
A crowded cruise ship, passengers awake nearby, crew members moving through corridors and decks, families sleeping only feet away behind thin cabin walls. And yet somewhere between night and sunrise, the continuity simply stops. No confirmed witness saw Amy leave the ship. No physical evidence established that she entered the water. No verified explanation ever accounted for how she disappeared from such a controlled environment without creating a clearer disturbance around the event itself. And for many people who followed the case closely, another detail only deepened the uncertainty surrounding the possibility of an unnoticed fall. Amy was known as a strong swimmer. Not proof that she survived. Not proof that she never entered the water. But enough to make the absence of evidence feel psychologically difficult to settle into with certainty. That absence created a gap investigators have never been able to fully close. Because once the ship docked in Curaçao, the timeline fragmented almost immediately. Passengers disembarked. Crew rotations continued, conversations became inconsistent, memories shifted over time. The environment investigators needed most existed only briefly before dissolving back into ordinary movement, and perhaps that is why the case continues to generate such persistent speculation decades later. Because the missing piece does not feel hidden somewhere far away. It feels as though it existed inside a very small, unnoticed window of time, minutes long, surrounded by people who may not have realized they were standing close to the most important moment in the case while it was happening. That possibility changes the emotional weight of the disappearance entirely, because Amy Bradley did not vanish from isolation. She vanished from proximity, from a place filled with light, music, conversations, security staff, crowded decks, and neighboring cabins, the kind of environment people instinctively associate with visibility and safety. And maybe that contradiction is what continues haunting the case nearly 3 decades later. Not only the possibility that something terrible happened, but the realization that whatever happened may have unfolded quietly enough that the world around it continued operating normally, while the timeline itself was already breaking apart unnoticed.
Imagine where she could be. The next day, my entire family is back here in the United States contacting anybody that they can to get the FBI involved to help us find Amy. It's important for people that decide to leave our ports and step on board any ship to know that a few miles out from the dock, you are now in international waters, and it is lawless. So when you are in international waters and there is no law, you have no rights. So we find out from my brother, and I do have a signed statement from the security officer, that a search was affected to include the bathrooms, the common areas, lockers, and she wasn't found. So that's not every nook and cranny. With that news, we have to get back on the boat.
The Bradleys are told to fly to St. Thomas to intercept the ship upon the FBI's recommendation.
We So he tells us what it is. And so we contact the videographer, and he's blown away.
Has come out of nowhere.
Tools in investigations, they're widely known to be not admissible in court in terms of the results of the polygraph, but they are definitely a tool.
.4/7 investigation, and contacts and phone calls. She did not leave the boat. She did not fall from the boat. Go lizard around her navel, and at the waistband a little below on her back, she's got a Chinese symbol with some Chinese writing on the inside. Something little, her baby fingers curve in. She's got a scar on her left shin, beautiful green eyes. So that's definitely significant ways to be able to identify. Since then, we have been working nonstop, and we're talking 21 years. We have had what we feel to be some very significant leads with credible individuals who have been interviewed. Some have been polygraphed. Of course, her life has been altered. Our lives have been altered and always will be till we get her back. You know, this is not a conspiracy theory. I mean, we've got facts. We've got things that have happened that we've lived with.
Amy Bradley's disappearance remains officially unresolved. The FBI still lists the case as an active missing persons investigation, and age-progressed images of Amy continue circulating publicly decades after she vanished from Rhapsody of the Seas. The reward connected to the case has remained active for years. Investigators still accept tips, and despite the amount of time that has passed, the possibility that someone knows more than they originally reported has never fully disappeared from the investigation. For Amy's family, the case never became something confined to the past. Her parents spent years following reported sightings, speaking publicly about the disappearance, and pushing for continued attention long after most cruise passengers from that week had returned to ordinary life. Because unlike cases that eventually settle into certainty, Amy Bradley's disappearance remained suspended between competing possibilities. No confirmed evidence established she died on board. But no verified proof ever demonstrated she survived afterward either. And maybe that unresolved tension is what continues making the case feel psychologically difficult to leave behind. A crowded cruise ship, open ocean, thousands of people nearby, an environment designed to feel controlled and observable. Yet somewhere between night and sunrise, one person disappeared so completely that nearly 3 decades later, investigators still cannot clearly identify the exact moment where ordinary life stopped accounting for where she went next. If you followed Amy Bradley's case all the way through, then you've probably felt the same contradiction that continues haunting the investigation itself. How does someone vanish from one of the most physically contained environments imaginable without anyone ever clearly seeing how it happened? And after everything uncovered over the years, what theory makes the most sense to you? If you have a perspective that genuinely fits the known timeline, leave it below. And if you're interested in unresolved disappearances, where the mystery survives, not because nothing exists, but because the final moments never fully connect, you can follow for the next case.